Good morning, everyone. This is Jack Chris. You're listening to the latest installment of the Now See Here podcast. We appreciate your listening, and we are thrilled and very honored to be joined by an advertising legend and now an author, Mr. Phillip Shirley. I'm going to hold this up for the YouTube audience. This is his latest book, The Graceland Conspiracy. Phillip, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for
Happy
coming.
to be here.
Thanks for coming on Now See Here. You know, we were just talking before we went on the air. I first met you when you were at Godwin Group, which is a regional powerhouse ad agency. I believe it was 1990 or 91, and it was you and the late Danny Mitchell, our good friend, and I think I went in to sell you an ad or something, and here we are all these years later. And you were telling me earlier, before we get into your career as a novelist, you're involved in advertising with the Godwin Group, but you're not. You're kind of in between. Where are you now?
Well, I'm still working. I still go to the office every week. We placed the company inside a holding company. We needed some expansion. We needed some marketing automation software that we couldn't afford to build ourselves. We needed some big data services. So we found a partner who had those other companies. And Godwin became a sister company. There are now 5 companies affiliated with each other under a holding company. So I've stayed involved. I'm not running it day to day as CEO, really working on major accounts, business development, and helping through the transition as we try to get ready for a new era of growth.
But you know, Phillip, I'm trying to recall all this in my mind. You've been in advertising. I guess you came into it right out of college. You were with Lucky, I believe, at one time?
Lucky is where I entered. I worked at Birmingham Southern College, actually, before that.
I see.
Started in the agency business in 1985 at Lucky in Birmingham.
And when did you come to Godwin and come to Jackson?
January 1, 1989, I started at Godwin.
And you started in the leadership position that you held for years.
I came as part of the transition, Godwin's 82 years old now.
Right.
And the second generation of owners were ready to transition. Danny Mitchell brought me in as part of that transition. So we began taking over and transitioning out of John Fontaine, Charlie Carmichael, and George Godwin. And those 3 were retiring as I was coming in over that day. In fact, Charlie Carmichael and George Godwin 5 years later, and we transitioned into what we considered sort of third generation of ownership. Since that time, we've gone into a 4th generation, and now maybe even a 5th generation with this combination of the company inside Local Marketing Solutions Group out of Chicago.
And if we have time a little later toward the close of the podcast, I may want to talk about modern advertising and get your opinion and feelings on that subject. But for now, you know, you've made the transition, the Graceland Conspiracy. I read a review. It was called preposterous. I can't even say the word preposterously entertaining. If I can get it out, it's early morning. I don't know who gave you that review, but I take it that's a positive review. This is the book, and you've written 2 other novels and a collection of short stories. Is that correct?
Yeah, one other novel, The White Lie, which is actually set in Jackson, Mississippi, if anyone hasn't read it. It came out about 4 years ago. You would recognize every scene in it. It starts literally in downtown Jackson, next to what used to be the Greyhound station.
Right.
At the traffic light, there's you may recall, for a while there, we used to see stories frequently about a drug bust there, where pot or some kind of drugs would be smuggled in from Texas or somewhere through the bus station, and they would have a drug bust there. And I often imagined what would happen if I saw that happen, and then that became the start of a novel, because there's an executive who's parked at that light. A drug bust happens, and he gets carjacked as one of the bad guys is trying to get away. And that's how the novel begins. And it takes place entirely in Jackson. You'll recognize every location in it.
You know, I think I see the transition from being an advertising executive into a novelist. I see the parallels, but maybe some of our listeners here at Now See Here don't. Tell me, what was it? There an advantage to you? Did you have a leg up on the would-be great American novelist who just starts from scratch? How did your career in advertising prepare or lead you to want to pursue a career as a novelist?
Well, I've always been a writer. I mean, all of my career has been based on writing. I mean, my very first job was a speech writer and representative for a federal agency, and then writing for Birmingham Southern College. Moved into the public relations side, but always writing was the basic skill. And I had published some poetry in college, and after college published a couple of books of poetry. As I moved into more of the commercial writing, the creative writing sort of fell to the side. I focused on my career and writing there, but I've always written speeches, ads, feature articles, whatever. And so I began to miss the creative writing about 15 years ago and started back, but I decided not to write poetry. It was very hard to, honestly, to get it published.
These days, yeah.
And so I started writing fiction, found that I liked it, began writing a lot of short stories to, in essence, teach myself how to write fiction, and submitted a number of those stories as a book to Jefferson Press in Chattanooga, no longer in business, but at the time they had the Jefferson Prize, and the book came in second in that contest, and they decided to publish the book, and that was my start into publishing fiction.
As a writer, who influenced you? Did you draw on the inspiration of or the work of other writers to inspire what you did here?
Well, there's certainly a lot of writers that I like. I mean, I don't know if I could go back that far and say who at that time, but I've always been influenced by writers. I like Elmore Leonard quite a bit. Currently, I read everything from Greg Iles. I think he's probably Mississippi's best currently living author, although the John Grisham fans are probably going to hate me, and I love John Grisham too, so let me add that. I've read everything he's written as well. But those are two of, I guess, the close by people that I like. We have some other great writers, though. Tom Franklin has written a couple of things that I think are just will be remembered through the ages. He's written some novels. I really like his short stories, a book of short stories called Poachers. Really fond of that book. So we have a lot of great people to admire and learn from in this region.
Well, then what sets Phillip Shirley as a novelist apart from those writers or any other national writers? I'll ask that as the first question. And secondly, do you consider yourself, Walker Percy used to hate to be asked this question, but do you consider yourself a Southern novelist? Outside of the geographical aspect, are you a Southern writer?
Well, I have lived was born in Alabama. I've lived in Alabama, Florida, Texas, and Mississippi. So I guess I'm thoroughly Southern. And I don't run from that label as a Southern writer. Geographically, I am, and content-wise, I am.
Okay.
Most of my stories are set in Mississippi and Alabama. So they reflect Southern lifestyles, although you will see that I don't write the sort of rural, downtrodden, live in a shack kind of Southern stuff. I'm really writing about the underbelly of the New South. Most of my stories take place in cities. And they're trying to explore that part of the South. My two last novels were set mostly in Birmingham and Jackson. Although the latest novel, The Graceland Conspiracy, starts in Birmingham. It goes to Texas. It goes to Mexico. Ends up in Venice, in Italy. So
that's
it's a
quite
little more,
a juncture.
It's a little more cosmopolitan in its outlook.
Well, then back to the first part of the question. And don't be humble. Be as honest and objective as you can. What do you think differentiates your fiction from those of Greg Iles or any Grisham or any writers in Mississippi or nationally?
Well, I don't know how to answer that in terms of what differentiates us. What I can tell you is what my goal is. My goal is not to write the next great American novel. That is simply not my goal, and that's probably not possible for me to do. That novel has been written. I mean, Mark Twain wrote it, or arguably Harper Lee wrote it.
Right.
The great American novel has been written. My goal is to give people 4 or 5 hours with their toes in the sand and the beach umbrella up and a good time. I mean, if you look at what this country is about, let's say it's about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I've spent the last 25 or 30 years on those first two, life and liberty. I have helped hospitals, doctors, banks, insurance companies, those who help people with their lives and their liberty, and try to connect people with services and products that make their life better, safer, healthier. That's been a part of what I've done in the marketing field. And now I'm totally focused on the third one, the pursuit of happiness. If I can give someone 4 or 5 good hours, then I've done my job. And that's what I'm after.
I've never heard an author say that. And you're to be applauded for that. I think that's wonderful because it is a form of escapism, and it's a form of entertainment. And you're not aiming to write, as you said, Atlas Shrugged or any great novel of ideas, but it's a novel people can enjoy and appreciate. Phillip Shirley is our guest here on Now See Here, the podcast. I'm Jack Criss. Since you are a Southern writer, you're not ashamed of that tag, and since your novels are based in the South, let me ask you then, do your books resonate with Northern audiences or Western audiences? What kind of feedback have you gotten from them?
The latest book has gotten a tremendous outpouring of support, to be honest with you.
The Graceland Conspiracy.
The reviews have been good. Clarion Ledger, of course, that's locally here. They had a great review, very positive. Mississippi Libraries Journal had a great review, recommended the book, very positive. It's been reviewed a couple of times in Alabama, very positive. The marketing initially has been in Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and so we're just now branching beyond that region. I'll be able to answer that question better in about 6 months, how it's being received nationally. But I've heard from people as far away as Seattle, and just recently heard from a friend in Italy who actually was involved in helping with translation. So I don't know if that counts, but what I'm hearing and what I'm suspecting is that this may be my best book. I personally think it is, but so far it's being well received. I'm getting literally 10 times more feedback from readers than I've ever gotten on anything else I've written, and I've probably published 100 pieces if you count feature articles and stories and so on.
You know, Phillip, I believe that people, especially those of us 40, 50 and over, still enjoy reading a book and holding it in their hands and the aesthetic pleasure of finishing a book or making notes in the margins. But the younger crowd, the ones who have been raised or are now totally immersed in social media, are they reading books anymore?
They do read books. I think the phenomenon of e-books is okay. I'm not against it. I've actually read e-books. I think it's situational in terms of what makes sense for you as the reader. If you're headed off to the beach and you're going to sit on the beach, you don't want to be reading a screen. You need to hold a book in your hand.
Right.
I like the feel. I like the smell of ink, and that's sort of an old-time approach, but I like to feel the paper and hold the book in my hand. But I'm not against Kindle. I mean, the Kindle version of the Graceland Conspiracy came out this week, in fact, and I'm happy for people to read it on Kindle, and I want them to. But in my life, Kindle has an application. If I'm flying somewhere for a week or two and I need more than one book, I don't want to haul a bunch of books in my suitcase. I'm going to put it on Kindle, or my wife's Kindle. And I don't blame people for doing that. I think that makes sense.
Who do you read for pleasure now? You mentioned Greg Iles.
I mentioned Greg Iles. I look forward to every book that comes out. I read Steve Berry. I've read most of his stuff. Dan Brown, of course, I've read, not as prolific as Steve Berry is, obviously. I read a lot of action adventure stuff. It's sort of, I call them boy books. Good guys,
Like chick
bad
flicks.
guys. There's a lot of espionage, conspiracy. Those are the kind of books that I enjoy. But I still read some fairly traditional literary novels as well.
And if you've ever received a negative or bad review, how do you handle it? Do you try to do you get your hackles up immediately, or do you try to get into
Yes.
the reviewer's mind and see why don't why don't they like the book? Do you try to understand the critique?
I've been fortunate not to get any bad reviews. I've had a
Good.
couple that were less than stellar. I try to do two things. One is, cuss them under my breath to make myself feel better. And then I try to go back and understand where I failed and see if I can learn a little something from it. But my books are not for everyone. And I understand that, and that's okay. There are plenty of people who do like them. The reviews I get and the reviews I get on Amazon are largely very favorable. Last time I looked, I had only 5-star reviews on Amazon. Now, not that
good.
many reviews. I had 26 last time I looked instead
Right.
of 2,600 like some national authors may have. But they're all favorable, and so I take that to heart and try to learn from it when there's a negative comment, and there's some out there, and that's okay.
The reason, Philip, I make the big bucks here on Now See Here, the podcast, is because I ask the tough questions. Let me ask you one. Coming from the advertising background, these days in the social media age, everyone and their cousin and the kid brother in the basement is suddenly a media expert. They're an advertising social media expert.
Sure.
Okay, and we know that's not true. Having said that, a lot of people think, oh, I can write. Can anyone write a book? As today, so many people think they can all or anyone can do advertising and media.
I will say this. I have rarely met a person who didn't have a book inside them.
Really? But can they sit down and do the actual writing and the
But
hard
only
work?
I would say far less than 1% of the people ever actually get that book written. But there are plenty of people who have a book and can write a book. I think almost everyone can write a book. It's a craft. Just like you can learn to dig a ditch straight, or you can learn to saw a 2x4 straight. It's a craft. It can be learned. Everyone can write a book. I encourage everyone to try their hand at writing, even if it's just a personal journal. It's an exploration. It's self-discovery. It's fun, and people should write.
And I still write longhand. I figure if Hugo could do it and people I admire, Dostoevsky, then I can do it. Do you use a computer or do you make notes as you go? How does Phillip Shirley compose his novel?
I haven't written anything longhand since the 80s.
Well.
I can type faster than a secretary. I can probably type 85 or 90 words a minute. A slow secretary, I should probably say. There are a lot of them who type faster than that, or if there are any secretaries left. But
Wait a minute, administrative assistant.
okay, well,
We have to be
Whatever.
politically correct.
well, okay. But I like to type. It's a skill, and I enjoy it, and I use that. I don't ever write longhand unless I'm just taking a few notes.
So how long does it take for the concept to go to the typewriter or the computer rather and to print? How long of a process is that for you normally?
Well, I've written and published 4 books in 10 years, so I guess if you could do the math and say about every 2.5 years I can write a book and get it accepted and published. But in reality, typically it takes a person, an average person, not some writers can write 2 or 3 books a year. Most can write about 1 a year. Maybe spend a second year editing and selling a book, and then it comes out a year later. So typically a book is about a 3-year, give or take, about a 3-year process to reach the street.
Do you write every day?
No.
Okay, just when you're working on the book. Or books.
I try to write regularly, but not necessarily every day. There are times that I will write intensively every day for weeks and weeks, and then I may miss 2 weeks and write nothing. I'm not one of those who feels like I have to sit there every day and write. I don't have a 1 hour or a 4 hour minimum or anything like that. I write when I feel compelled to write. When I get on a deadline, I'll work very hard and work all day and weekends to get it done. But no, I don't write every day.
Roddy Merritt of Merritt Media is our technician. Roddy, how much time have we got? Couple of minutes. In the remaining time we've got, Phillip, first of all, I want you to tell our listeners and viewers on YouTube how they can get your book. And then if you would, tell me about what you were discussing with me before we went on the air, and it's a charity you're involved with in your home state of Alabama. Those two questions answered, please.
Okay. Well, all of my books are available, hopefully from your local bookstore. If they don't have it, they can order it. I always encourage people to support the independent bookstores. They have a difficult path in life to survive, and so we support independent bookstores. But Barnes & Noble and Barnes & Noble Online have the book. Amazon has all of my books. But I always encourage people, shop your local independent bookstore first. If you can't get it there, by all means, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble.
Of course. And in Alabama, what are you doing with young inmates?
We are at the Alabama Writers Forum, which is a partnership program of the Alabama State Council on the Arts, and I've been on that board for over 10 years. We do a number of things to serve the literary community. We support events. We help select the Harper Lee Award winner. We help found and support the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame. But the program that perhaps is the most touching and the most important is called Writing Our Stories. And we put writing teachers into the schools where at-risk youth are being educated. A very important program, very worthy of support. It's probably the most important thing we do, although all of our work supporting the literary community, I think, helps make the state a better place.
And I will do a show on that in the future.
Right.
You gave me some contacts, and we'll do that. Mr. Phillip Shirley, he is an advertising legend. That's how I first met him, from Godwin Group, and now he is carving his own niche as a well-renowned novelist here in the South. Phillip, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we'll have you on again, and good luck with the books. Are these my copies?
Thank you, Jack. Yes, you can have those, but I haven't signed them to you yet.
Well, and that's the great thing about having your own podcast. You get free books. So, Phillip, thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to reading your books. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Folks, this is Now See Here, the podcast. I'm Jack Chris. Thank you for listening.